Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones Season 5 book-to-show comparison. In this video, I compare Season 5 of Game of Thrones to the novels A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, on which it is based. I named my top 5 things I thought the show did better than the books, and my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show. I'm going to have to give a spoiler warning for the book series. If you haven't read them all up to A Dance with Dragons, you may want to be a bit cautious, as there are some things that happen in those books that haven't happened in the show, so I may end up spoiling some things for you that still may yet occur in Season 6, and of course spoiler warning for up until the end of Season 5. So Season 5 was quite a controversial season as far as book adaptations go, as it is the biggest departure from the source material yet, and no doubt this divide is only going to get worse. However, the show had acquired a lot of criticism from fans of the novels, as many were unhappy about many characters and storylines being cut out and the way that the show changed events and characters from the novels. I myself felt, personally, many book fans were being a bit unfair to the show and overall felt that the show did a good job. However, as with any season of Game of Thrones, I felt the show did some things better than the books, and in other areas it failed to live up to the source material. So let me go through some of those now. Starting with my top 5 things I felt the show did better than the books in Season 5. Number 5 is Tyrion's storyline. This is one storyline in particular that was severely cut down from the book. In the show, Tyrion gets from Pentos to Volantis in 2 episodes, whereas in the books he takes many chapters to get there and has a lot of adventures along the way that were all cut from the show. Most notably was a group of characters he met on his journey to Volantis. In the book, it wasn't Varys he was traveling with, but a whole group of characters, the main 2 being Griff and young Griff, who will most likely go on to become major players in the books, who were cut from the show entirely, and I strongly believe that they have been cut from the show permanently and will never appear. I'm actually really happy about this, as young Griff was revealed to be Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen, who was believed to be killed when Tywin sacked King's Landing at the end of Robert's Rebellion. This revelation meant that Aegon had a better claim to the throne than Daenerys, and I really hated this, as I felt we spent all this time with Daenerys and then out of nowhere this guy just with a better claim just appears. However, there is a strong possibility he isn't a Targaryen but a Blackfyre, and therefore doesn't have a stronger claim than Dany. But even if that is the case, I'm still glad that the show cut these characters out altogether. Another character that was cut from the show was Penny, a naive dwarf that Tyrion gets involved with in a bizarre relationship. I'm glad that she was cut as well, as I didn't really find her all that necessary. There's also a lot of other shenanigans Tyrion was involved in the books once he got to Meereen that was cut. As in the books, he has yet to meet Daenerys, and the show jumped straight to that, and that's another thing I much preferred, that they cut to the chase and just show Dany and Tyrion together. Because it was a bit frustrating in A Dance with Dragons how the 2 of them haven't met yet, and I think that wouldn't have worked at all for the TV show. And plus, the situation they set up in Season 6 with Tyrion being in charge of Meereen seems very interesting indeed. So overall, I was much happier with the way his storyline played out in the show. Number 4 is the fighting pits. Now, I make no secret that this was my favorite scene in the entire show's run so far. I just loved it so much, and therefore you may be wondering why it isn't higher on this list, and the reason being is that this scene was also really awesome in the books, and one of my favorite scenes in the books as well, and I only found it slightly better than how it played out in the books. As in the books, there was no massive Sons of the Harpy terror attack at the fighting pits. Jorah didn't fight in the fighting pits, and Drogon didn't come to save Daenerys. Rather, Drogon just came because he was attracted by the smell of blood and started feasting on one of the fallen pit fighters, which the Meereenese found offensive, so they attacked him and Drogon defended himself. And it eventually led to Daenerys hopping a ride and flying him out of there to save his life. It was still an amazingly awesome scene. I remember being so blown away by it when I first read it, but I was even more blown away by what I saw in the show, as it was made much more exciting. By first beginning with Jorah in the fighting pits and having them show Dany's connection to Jorah re-emerge, as clearly she didn't want him to die, and then the massive Sons of the Harpy attack, which was scary, intense as hell, and all topped off with Drogon coming by to save Daenerys' life by setting a bunch of harpies on fire. I really liked how the show not only amped up the tension and suspense, but also played up the connection Daenerys has with her dragons as they were building to it all season. These are great changes which made the scene better than the books. Number 3 is Margaery and Tommen. Both characters appear more in the show than they did in the books, and they are much more developed and more interesting in the show. Like many characters, they have been aged up, as in the books Tommen is 8 and Margaery is a teenager, whereas in the show Tommen is about 12 or 13 and Margaery is in her 20s, which changes the dynamic of the story significantly. As in the books, Tommen is just a whiny little kid who likes to play with cats and puts his stamp on official orders that he has no idea what they mean. So Margaery tries to manipulate him the way one would manipulate a little kid, but the only result is he whines to Cersei, who then easily brushes the 8-year-old aside. Whereas in the show, having Tommen be about 12 or 13 completely changes the dynamic, as he's old enough to be a bit more aware of what's going on, but still is really inexperienced. And of course it means he's old enough to be sexually active, which does prevent the show from using the same plot that was in the books, with the Faith Militant charging Margaery with losing her maidenhead, as in the book, since Tommen is too young to have sex, and she was meant to have never consummated her marriage to Renly or Joffrey. She was meant to be a virgin, but not so in the show, as Tommen is of age. However, the show found another way around it through Loras, to have the Faith Militant lock up Margaery, and that was fine. Maybe not as good as it was in the books, but worth it in order to have the storyline of Margaery manipulating Tommen through sex rather than ice cream and cats. Also, it does add an element because it raises the possibility that she could get pregnant by him, which would secure her hold on the throne, which makes it even more urgent for Cersei to get rid of her. And of course, the fact that Margaery is more of a fleshed out character in the show made her conflict with Cersei all the more interesting and powerful, and it was one of the things I was most looking forward to in the show, and the show did not disappoint at all. Number 2 is Arya's storyline. I know a lot of people were complaining about Arya's storyline in Season 5, as many said she was just sweeping the floors or washing bodies the whole time, but to be perfectly honest, I found her storyline in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons far more boring, and was never really on board with it. Her storyline in the show was much more succinct and to the point, and therefore I found it much more interesting. And I was a huge fan of the show's decision to bring back Jaqen H'ghar and have him be her mentor rather than the kindly man. And that was a wise decision on the show's part, as they were always closer in the show than they were in the books, and it makes more sense for the show to bring back someone the audience is already familiar with rather than to keep introducing more characters. However, it is possible that this Jaqen H'ghar isn't the same man Arya met in Season 2, and that's one of the big things about the way the show handled the storyline, was the way they ended it with Jaqen dying, but then Arya discovering that it wasn't really Jaqen, as the waif suddenly turned into Jaqen. This one scene managed to drive home visually a point that didn't come off as strong as it did in the books, that the Faceless Men truly are no one and have no identity, and they combine that with Arya going blind to make a truly powerful and amazing mind-bending scene that was, to me, far more powerful and effective than what had occurred in the books. So I applaud the showrunners for really improving upon this storyline, which had an amazing ending. And my number one thing I felt the show did better than the books in Season 5 is the White Walkers. The portrayal of the White Walkers has always been one of my biggest complaints about the show, because it does seem a case of show not tell, how in the show we're often told how big of a threat the White Walkers are, but never actually really shown it, which is a detriment in a visual medium. I personally found it hard to get all worked up over a group of beings we never actually see, so it was a very wise decision to finally have a huge battle, or a slaughter really, with one of our main heroes, Jon Snow, present. That show how dangerous the White Walkers really are. The White Walkers, referred to as the Others in the books, although I personally like to call them the White Walkers, because the term Others always makes me think of these guys, and so it takes away from some of the fear and tension. Besides the fact in the books, the White Walkers is another term that the Free Folk use for the Others. So White Walkers applies to both the show and the books, whereas Others only applies to the books. Anyway, in the books, the White Walkers never really appear either. However, you did kind of get to see more of them in action in the battle at the Fist of the First Men at the start of A Storm of Swords, which was kind of glossed over in the show. But overall, they work a bit more in the books as an ominous background presence, because the books are able to build more on the lore surrounding them than the show can. However, I still found having the battle at Hardhome and seeing the leader of the White Walkers stare down Jon Snow to be a far more effective way to show the White Walkers are a true threat to Westeros, rather than the way it played out in the books. As in the books, there was a mission to retrieve a band of wildling refugees from Hardhome, but Jon Snow didn't go, so no viewpoint character was there, and it was only talked about and never seen. And while it's assumed the refugees were killed by the White Walkers, they were never actually seen, and there was no huge battle. So it was more effective in the show to actually see this huge battle. Plus, there was the thing with the Valyrian steel being able to kill White Walkers. In the book, Sam just reads about it in some books, whereas in the show you actually see Jon Snow kill one of the White Walkers with Longclaw, which was a much more exciting way to do it. So overall, I was much more impressed with the way the White Walkers were handled in Season 5 than the way that they were handled in the books, making this my number one thing I felt the show did better than the books in Season 5. So now on to my top 5 things I felt the books did better than the show in Season 5. So these are 5 examples where the show failed to adapt the source material properly. Starting with my number 5, Theon's redemption. In the books, Reek snaps out of being Theon because he hears his name coming from a weirwood tree, so he interprets it as the old gods talking to him. That eventually leads him to remember that he is Theon. And of course, Mance Rayder's Spearwives also help him come to this realization as things start to come to a head in Winterfell, which eventually leads to him becoming Theon again. But we know that it wasn't the old gods talking to Theon through the tree, it was in fact Bran who was warging into the weirwood tree, which has awesome implications for what Bran will be able to accomplish, and there's an opportunity that the show just skipped right over. I can see what the show was going for. They were trying to make the reason Theon snaps out of being Reap be Sansa, by having Sansa slowly chip away at Theon to get him to remember who he really is, and that way Sansa could take control of her own destiny and be the one that ultimately is responsible for freeing herself, because she used her powers of manipulation in order to get Theon to free her. I could tell that that's what they were going for, but I don't think they quite got there. The scene where Sansa gets Theon to admit that Bran and Rickon are still alive was really cool. And it did show Sansa was a capable person and no longer the weak child who simply let herself be used and abused like she did with Joffrey. But the scene where Theon finally snaps out of being Reek was totally unbelievable. Again, I know what they were going for. That Sansa's life was put in danger and that was enough to snap him out of it. But again, I don't think they quite got there. On screen, the change just seemed all of a sudden and just came out of nowhere, and so it was unbelievable. As 1 minute he's telling Sansa to just go with Miranda, and the very next moment, all of a sudden he's throwing Miranda off the balcony and ready to jump off the castle wall with Sansa. And it was just way too sudden and not at all believable, and was handled much better in the books. Number 4 is lack of warging in the show. In the show up to season 5, the only Stark child shown to have the ability to warg is Bran, whereas in the books they all have this ability. Robb and Rickon weren't viewpoint characters, so they were never shown to have this ability, but there were some hints given, particularly with Robb, that they may have had this ability. And Sansa was the one exception, as she was never shown to have this ability, but that's probably because her direwolf lady was killed off early on. And the Stark children typically learn to warg through their direwolves. It is possible that Sansa will develop warging abilities through other animals later on in the books, or perhaps because she lost Lady earlier on, she'll never learn that skill. We'll just have to see. But in the books, the main two differences are Arya and Jon Snow, who were both shown to have warging abilities. Jon Snow displayed these abilities as early as A Clash of Kings, which corresponds with Season 2, where he had strange dreams where he could see through ghosts' eyes. In fact, when he met the wildlings and went undercover, they referred to him as a warg because they could tell he had a connection with Ghost. And it is highly theorized that at his death at the end of A Dance with Dragons, that he warged into Ghost because he said Ghost's name before he died, and Melisandre strongly warned him to keep Ghost nearby right before his stabbing. Whereas in the show, there's never been any foreshadowing with Jon's ability to warg into Ghost, and therefore it seems unlikely that this will happen in the show. In fact, Ghost was severely underused in Season 5 overall, as the only function he served was to save Sam from some Night's Watchmen that were beating him up. And then there's Arya, who had been having references to wolf dreams from very early on, which were similar to the dreams we saw Bran having in Season 2, where he warged into Summer. At the same time, Arya was having these dreams where she warged into Nymeria, as Nymeria was wandering through the Riverlands, apparently becoming the leader of a pack of wolves. And this played an even bigger part when Arya was training to become a faceless man and trying to lose all of her identities. These wolf dreams were preventing her from doing so, as they reminded her of who she really was. And there was a scene where after she went blind where she warged into a cat that we're not likely to see in the show, since the show has done absolutely nothing to establish her warging ability. I suppose it's still possible they could still introduce Arya and Jon's warging abilities in the show, but honestly I think they should have done this already, making this something the books pulled off better than the show. Number 3 is the Wall storyline. Now, of course, the huge caveat is the Hardhome sequence, which as I mentioned, I thought was handled much better in the show. However, excluding that, the Wall storyline in Season 5 failed to live up to the source material. In the books, there was just so much more going on at the Wall, with Jon Snow trying to rescue the wildlings and integrate them into the Night's Watch. In the show, he doesn't even get to the wildlings until episode 8, so they're not even brought back to the Wall until right before his stabbing. And the ones already there weren't even seen or touched on that much. Whereas in the books, he's integrating them into the Night's Watch from the get-go, and they are working together throughout Book 5. In fact, a few wildlings even joined the Night's Watch to become Night's Watch brothers, thus making them truly integrated. And then there was Stannis. As in both the books and the show, his main reason for going to the Wall was to help fight the White Walkers, but in the show, he does absolutely bub-kiss to help accomplish this. Except for one conversation he has with Sam where he encourages him to learn more about the White Walkers. He never even mentions them other than that, and they were the whole frickin' reason he went there in the first place. Whereas in the books, he works with Jon to help rebuild some of the castles on the Wall and try to beef up their defenses along the Wall. Jon even gives Stannis a castle along the Wall so he can man it and protect it against the White Walkers. And overall, Jon is also trying to rebuild many other abandoned castles along the Wall, whereas in the show, we just get some throwaway line where he orders Janos Slynt to rebuild an abandoned castle, which seems really out of place, as there was no other talk in the show about them manning the Wall or rebuilding these old castles. It's still uncertain if he still sent people to rebuild the castle after Janos Slynt was beheaded. In fact, the wildlings were a huge help in helping them rebuild these castles, and that was just completely left out of the show. So Overall, the reasons for the Night's Watchmen deciding to stab Jon Snow were much weaker in the show, as the wildlings were much more integrated in the Night's Watch than in the books. And there's also the Pink Letter, which was the letter Ramsay sent to Jon threatening him after fake Arya's escape. And then Jon decided to break the Night's Watch rules against being involved in the affairs of the Seven Kingdoms to attack the Boltons, which led to the mutiny, which cost his life. These were all much stronger reasons for the brothers to stab him, whereas in the show they actually had more reasons not to stab him because they actually saw the White Walkers attack at Hardhome. Thus he was proven to have the correct strategy, and yet they stabbed him anyway. And then there's Ollie, who was so poorly handled in the show, as they foreshadowed to death that he was going to do something bad to Jon Snow, making his involvement in the stabbing totally obvious. I just felt the whole thing was handled very poorly and not nearly as effectively as it was in the books. And ultimately, the whole Season 5 Wall storyline felt really rushed, and they didn't take their time to tell a great story like they did in the books. Number 2 is the Winterfell storyline. So unlike a lot of people, I wasn't opposed to the idea of Sansa Stark taking over Jane Poole's storyline as Ramsay's bride. In fact, when I first heard about it, I was excited and I thought it was a great idea and a good way to bring Ramsay and Theon's character back into the main fold by bringing in an important character like Sansa. And I do think there are ways this could have been pulled off well, but what they actually did in the show failed to live up to the Winterfell storyline in the books. And I was also okay with them leaving out Wyman Manderly and the Freys and Mance Rayder and his Spear Wives. I get why they may want to simplify and uncomplicate the storyline. However, I thought the way that they did it was a bit lacking, and there were many missed opportunities. Particularly the opportunity of having Brienne and Podrick present in the area. They could have used them as a stand-in for the Manderlys or the Spear Wives and had some adapted version of the storyline take place with Brienne instead, but instead they simply wasted Brienne and had her stand around in the snow all season long waiting for a candle that was never lit, and when it finally was lit, she wasn't even frickin' there to see it. I too was okay with Sansa's wedding night scene, and I couldn't possibly disagree more with all the controversy surrounding it, because as soon as they decided to give Jane Poole's storyline to Sansa, that was the inevitable outcome. Anything else would have been bad writing. However, even though it wasn't as bad as what happened to Jane Poole in the books, I was against the way Sansa was locked up all day and raped and beaten repeatedly after her wedding night. I think that was unnecessary, and because they changed Jane to Sansa, that aspect of the story should have changed as well. But the main problem was in the books, you had this situation of high tension where everyone who was there for Ramsay's wedding was snowed in at Winterfell, trapped there, where, people were mysteriously being murdered, and the Freys and the Manderlys were at each other's throats, and it created this high tension. It's like this huge murder mystery, and then it ended with this spectacular battle of wits between Mance Rayder and his Spear Wives with the Boltons, which concluded with a suspenseful and exciting ending in which Theon and Jane Poole were forced to jump off the castle walls to escape. None of this tension and excitement was present in the show, even though the opportunity was there to do a different version of it with Brienne. Instead, Sansa just stood helplessly by, and Brienne wasn't even there to see her signal for help. Theon just all of a sudden helped Sansa in a scene that felt really rushed and unbelievable. So overall, utterly failing to live up to the quality of storytelling in the books. And the number one thing I felt the books did better than the show in Season 5 should come as no big shock to anyone. It's the Dorne storyline. Similar to the Sansa thing, I didn't really hate these storylines as much as everyone else seemed to, as there was a lot of complaining and moaning about the Sand Snakes, whereas I didn't really have a problem with them. I could see why they weren't that interesting, but I didn't think they were that bad either. And the complaint that I really didn't get was the complaint that the show only had 3 of the 8 Sand Snakes, because of course they did. I would have been shocked had they had any more than those 3, because these were the only 3 of any importance in the book. So had they included more of them, I would have just shocked me beyond belief. In fact, an argument could be made that the Sand Snakes altogether could have been cut from the show because they haven't even been in the books all that much. And Ariane, who was cut from the show entirely, had a much bigger part to play in the books. But my main beef with Dorne wasn't the Sand Snakes, or the fight scene with Jaime and Bronn, or Tyene flashing her boobs and telling Bronn he wants the bad pussy. I didn't really have that big of a problem with any of that. My main beef was the lack of Doran's master plan, and the fact that Dorne was underused. I heard some people complaining that there should have been less of Dorne, but they don't understand that's what the problem was with Dorne in the first place. It was too underused. They introduced all these new characters and hardly gave them any screen time, so of course they're going to come off as being two-dimensional cardboard cutouts. Alexander Siddig was outstanding as Prince Doran and was criminally underused. But I don't mind that Ariane was cut and her storyline was given to Ellaria Sand. That could have been good if done properly, but the problem was it wasn't done properly. Having the storyline simply be about Ellaria trying to kill Myrcella to start a war with the Lannisters because Oberyn died in a trial by combat that he agreed to and lost because he was being too arrogant and overconfident was utterly ridiculous, and more to the point, far too simplistic. As I said, the biggest travesty was Doran did not have a master plan. It didn't have to be a marriage alliance to the Targaryens, but it needed to be something. I spent the whole break leading up to Season 5 speculating on what Doran's master plan might be, but it turned out it was nothing. He didn't even have one, which made him a significantly less interesting character. The Dorne storyline in the books wasn't a fan favorite, but it was far, far superior to what they did in the show, and I would say this is the biggest fuck up the show has ever done in adapting a storyline from the books, making this the #1 thing the books did better than the show in Season 5. So that's it for my Game of Thrones book to show comparisons for Season 5. You can check out my channel for many more Game of Thrones videos, and hang tight for my Game of Thrones Season 6 filming updates and predictions, which will be coming in a few months. So make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.